All right, so hey there, AP Europeans. This video, we're going to take a look at first of two videos on topic 6.4, the social effects of industrialization. And here we're going to focus on class identity. In the second video, we'll get around to a couple of other topics, namely we're going to take a look at urbanization, and then we'll also take a look at how the industrial development is going to affect family structures. But let's talk about class identity here. So when we have talked about class and class identities in this class, we have been talking traditionally in here about feudalism and manorialism. This is the world of the great chain of being, where your class identity was based entirely centered around what class of society you were born into, and nothing could really be done to change that. Well, change is coming because over in industrialized Europe, primarily in the northern and western parts of the continent, England, Germany, France, there is going to be a significant change in class identity and how people identify themselves, and it's going to create these. It's going to happen through divisions of labor and the socioeconomic changes that you kind of cause them. Basically, when you get into these factory systems, there's people that it's management and it's labor, and the laborers are going to be the lower end of what's going on a new pyramid structure of how this is kind of put together. But it's not really based on birth. It's kind of based on your economic status, your job placement, if you want to think about it that way. And so it's a very normal 21st century way to think that your job kind of helps identify, like, if you're going to be middle class, upper class, lower class, economically speaking anyway. This is really that idea that we have, that you're identifying your level in society based on your income. It starts here in this industrialization sort of movement. So these socioeconomic changes and these new divisions of labor that are coming up, it is going to lead to self-conscious classes. This is kind of a new concept. The idea of like being conscious of what level of society you were in. It was more along the lines of, like, I guess peasants always knew they were peasants, but they were peasants because of like some sort of like greater plan that God had ordained for them. Well, now there's this sense of self-conscious classes where you're just putting new labels based on the type of work that you're doing. So if you are in the working class, lower economic classes, those folks are called the proletariat. And proletariat just really kind of means like laborers and working class individuals. The bourgeoisie is bougie, right? That is the middle class. And as we've seen, like in a couple different levels of the class so far, we've kind of gone from there being like a consumer culture to the French bourgeois middle class that's kind of doing things. The bourgeoisie, these are folks that are really kind of aware they've got enough money that they can afford to spend money on things that they want, not just things that they have to have. And this is how they're going to start defining themselves based on the products that they own. And so those different layers of what's happening here, it's going to have a real impact on things moving forward. We're going to get more into this, but just to make sure we are keeping track of the rest of the continent and those areas in southern and eastern Europe that aren't really seeing much in the way of industrialization, the agricultural elites are going to stay like really dominant. That is the landed aristocracy, landlords and peasants that are, kind of doing farm work in these localized communities, these farm communities. Like Russia is not going to see much change for another couple of generations. Okay, so back to these classes. When it comes down to class identity, the middle classes, in here I'm primarily thinking about England, because the British are seeing like these changes happen first because they industrialize first. So in British society, the middle classes, the characteristics that they've got is that they are more willing to participate in philanthropic, political, and social associations. So politically and socially, they've got money, and so they're a little bit more socially active. And I don't mean just going out and having a good time. I mean, they are kind of like adopting, ideas for a good good cause, like establishing charitable organizations and trying to help the community come together to help combat certain problems, whether they're doing that through like a political process trying to talk to their member of parliament, or if they're doing that through church organizations. That is a social association that's going with this. Philanthropy is the idea of giving back to the community. And so this is where charitable organizations come into play. In the middle class, it was seen as kind of like a rite of passage. You knew that you were going to be of an upper, tier in society if you, in fact, were able to, well, donate money to some charitable cause, some philanthropic cause that's going to be good for the community. Whether that means you're donating for a charitable organization that's based out of a church, but more likely you're kind of supporting the local theater, or you're supporting like the museums that are going to have some sort of greater social benefit than just like handouts to the poor or running a soup kitchen or something like that. For the working classes on this, their level of participation in these type of social groups, it's more like trade unions or mutual aid societies. Whereas like philanthropic groups, they're trying to raise money for different causes. Mutual aid societies, it's kind of like volunteer work, that you're doing things to try to help out your local community. That could be working in a soup kitchen, or working, sort of donating some time to work with an orphanage in some cases to make sure that people are well taken care of. And when it comes down to laboring, the laboring classes and how it's going to work and try to help out other workers, trade unions are going to be a big thing on this. It's important for me to point out to you that all of these, by the time we get into Unit 7, all of these different groups, they are all going to develop into some kind of bigger political parties once you get another layer of democracy added into this European society, because it's still not exactly there just yet. So with these new classes and with these new class identity that's there, you kind of end up with a new social order that's coming into play. And what you see during this time period in the 19th century is a real growth of the people in the middle class. It's not just about wage earners to be on a survivability basis, but there's a growing pocket of people, 20 to 30 to 40 to 50 to 60% of the people are trying to achieve like some status in this middle class level of things. So much so that you get like the bourgeoisie, that middle class, is now splitting into a couple of different levels on its own. There's the upper bourgeoisie, which is, well, kind of the wealthier of this group, and then there's the petite bourgeoisie. It's like the little middle class, like the people that are maybe trying to emphasize that they're middle class even though they don't really have all that much money. It's a little bit of that consumerism can go a long way if you can just look like you have more money than what you really do. The reality on this, though, is like there's this idea that you can kind of like achieve whatever you want to achieve as you go through this. But as things roll through the 19th century, and as these factories that we've seen in video, and we've got the power looms here, as these factories get bigger, it just seems like there's less opportunity for advancement. Like these factories that are kind of running and employing maybe dozens of people, but if you're going to advance to some management level and kind of get a better job in these situations, there's just not that many jobs that are there. And you could have one person that is supervising a dozen people in this part of the factory, but there's really not much a chance of advancement for the dozen people that are being supervised, because those jobs just don't really exist. It's important in this system to have a lot of laborers at that laboring class, and this is going to create some distinctions, and it's going to cause some tensions between the middle classes and the upper classes and that proletariat wage earning lower class. And I struggle a little bit because the middle class is in the middle and the upper class is at the top. But there's just a different connotation when you call somebody lower class. Even if you're just talking economically speaking, it just has this negative connotation to it. And so like the more appropriate term to use is the proletariat class, or the wage earning class. what people of this working class are really finding their lives are centered around is that there's just more discipline in their day-to-day life than what they're used to. They have to be at work at a certain time. They have to, take a break at a certain time, and they don't have that much personal freedom as they're going through the day-to-day requirements of their daily business. It's kind of like being a high school student that you feel like you've got freedoms, but not necessarily when you are like in the workforce or in the schoolhouse, that you're sacrificing those freedoms as a way to, well, make the money that you are making. And if you don't want to be part of that, well, you don't really have to be part of that, but you're going to find yourself in a poorhouse. A poorhouse is somewhere between like a debtor's prison and an asylum, or just kind of living on the street. And they're trying really hard not to have like just vagrancy on the streets. And so poorhouses, they're kind of like forced labor houses, where if you find yourself in debt, you can end up in a job where you are working strictly to try to lower your debt, maybe not exactly eliminate it, but in some arguments you can say that it's a different version of like indebted slavery that is going through this. And it's a real controversial aspect of what's happening here in the early to mid 19th century. Along those lines, child labor is another thing that is going to have some real problems taking place here. So, back in the old cottage industry, men, women, and children, the entire family would be working together. But when you're talking about what's happening in this, like these factories, and this is a textile mill, right? But if you're talking about a bigger factory that's dealing with like some kind of like metalwork production, it's not really a place for a kid to be. And so if kids aren't really like supposed to be there, well then what are you supposed to do? Well, one option is that they could go to orphanages if their parents are in the poorhouse, or if their parents have just died in some kind of, industrial accident, or they have gotten sick and died, because it's not like health systems have caught up with everything just yet. When you compare this to the cottage industry, it does seem like the most appropriate place for them to be would be at work, because in the cottage industry, kids worked doing some of the same things that they would be able to do here. And so what you end up seeing in the early part of the 1800s is more and more kids working, well, regular jobs, just like adults would work regular jobs. And through the 18 and check the time frame on this as well. When we're talking about like this type of industrial development, it's really in England, it's big in the 1800s and 1810s and going to the 1820s, but it's not until like the 1830s and 40s where you see any kind of real specific child labor laws coming into being. And look, when we're talking about these child labor laws, we're talking like some baby steps on this. So in the Factory Act of 1833, basically for kids that were, between the age of 9 and 13, they were allowed to work 8 hours a day. If you were 14 to 18 years old, you could work 12 hours a day, which would be about what an adult shift would be. Businesses weren't supposed to hire children under age 9. Those kids were supposed to go to schools, which the factory owners are supposed to provide for them, but that didn't really happen. And so there's problems that are going along those lines. And ironically enough, there are families that are kind of working against child labor laws because they wanted to have the children with them in the workplace, which meant working with them in the workplace. So it's not as clear cut as like it's a horrible thing that we need to get rid of. The Mines Act of 1842 basically, and the bar's pretty low on how much progress this is going to make, but this kind of makes all child labor illegal from working underground in these mines as long as you were under age 10. But if you were a preteen, working in a coal mine was an acceptable job for you to have, and, well, maybe not the safest of working conditions. Which, speaking of the working conditions and the living conditions that people have got, this guy Friedrich Engels, he's German but living in the UK at this point. In 1844, he writes a booklet called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And spoiler alert, in this book, he concludes that the working class conditions are terrible, that they lead to death and disease, and unless something is done, well, England could face the same sort of mass revolt that well, the French had been seeing back in the 1780s, 1790s. So this is kind of shaping up to be some real social tension a little bit down the road. Definitely a topic that we will have to come back to when we get a little bit further into the unit.